Hey class, so this week we are talking about the legal foundation for special education. So I want to take some time and go over a couple of the changes under IDEA, talk about some specific things within there, and then a couple other key points from the chapter. So we talked briefly last week about a few litigation cases that were really foundational for students with special needs. So looking at litigation starting in the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education is really the seminal case that started to look at segregation within our schools. You guys have probably all heard of Brown versus Education, but this is the court case that said that the exclusion of children who were African American in separate schools was essentially not equal. So separate does not mean equal education. And that was the court case that started to integrate our schools in the 1950s. Now, obviously, that was a really long process and really didn't hit students with disabilities until we come to these court cases in the early 1970s. So Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was in 1972, and this case obviously was in Pennsylvania, and it was a case that involved the schools were secluding students with basically with intellectual disabilities. Their rule was that if a student had not attained the mental age of 5 by first grade, then they were excluded from school. Well, obviously, all of our students who have moderate, severe, profound intellectual disabilities had not obtained a mental age of 5 by first grade. So all of those students were being excluded from schools. So that court case ruled that schools could not segregate or exclude students with intellectual disabilities, that they were entitled to a free, appropriate public education. The next court case in 1972 was Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia. This court case was similar to the Park case, but this looked at students who had more emotional and behavioral disorders, and these students were being excluded, and the school district was basically saying that the extensive cost that it took to educate these students warranted their exclusion from school. So the court ruled in 1972 that extensive cost was not a reason in which students could be excluded from their schools. So kind of as an answer to these court cases, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act was passed in 1975 by Congress, and that's the beginning of our what we now know as IDEA. So I'm going to go over kind of the changes that happened through the Education for All Handicapped Children Act as the law was amended and then finally turned to IDEA. I'm going to go through this really briefly. This is all in your textbook. So under the original Education for All Handicapped Children Act, we have FAPE, which is Free Appropriate Public Education, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth about in a minute. The requirement of related services for students. The notion that you cannot deny services based on the cost, and that came from that court case we just talked about in 1972 where students are being denied based on the extensive cost. Comprehensive evaluations were now required. So a student couldn't simply be looked at and said, well, they need to go, here. And extensive comprehensive evaluation had to be done on that student to determine their intellectual functioning in addition to other aspects of that student. Reevaluations are now required. So a student can't be evaluated at the age of 4 and then never again be evaluated. So a law was put into place to say you have to reevaluate every so many years. IEPs were required. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about what an IEP is in a minute. And then the notion of educating within the least restrictive environment, which we talked about last week. So our First Amendment was in 1986. And in the 1980s, the addition of services for younger children was added. So services were now provided for students ages 3 through 5. And then early intervention was put into place. So this is birth to 3. So kids who were served in schools from 3 to 5, and then prior to age 3, early intervention was put into place. And so we have IFSPs, which are individualized family service plans that are now put into place because we're starting to see that early intervention was key for some students with disabilities to get in early and to intervene. In 1990, this was very important and something I hope you guys have already read about last week. So, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act was renamed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the reason for that was that the term handicapped children was really no longer an appropriate term to use. One, the term handicap really isn't politically correct, but also we're within the term of Education of All Handicapped Children Act, we weren't really reflecting person first language. So now we're looking at, we want to make sure that we're referring to a child first. So it's a child with a disability, not a disabled child. So this idea of person first language really came into play around this time. If you haven't read the handout on person first language, I encourage you to go and do that. It is very important, and I expect you guys to use person first language throughout this class. So just know that you place your emphasis on the person first. Their disability is not the primary thing that we note these students by. So that change was made. In addition, added categories of autism and traumatic brain injury were included within IDEA. The notion of transition services was now required, so students were required to have transition services placed into their IEP, and those services had to be in place by the time a student was the age of 16. In addition, assistive technology had to be addressed. So if a student required any sort of assistive technology to thrive within their educational system, then that was required, had to be specified within each student's IEP. In 1997, some amendments were made. So students with disabilities were now included within state and district-wide assessments. And if it was deemed that those assessments were not appropriate, alternative assessments were created. So if you know anything about alternative assessments within the state of Georgia, our students with significant disabilities, they do not take the standardized assessments like the high school graduation test, but they take what's called the Georgia Alternative Assessment. So it is a statewide assessment for students with significant disabilities that takes the place of our current assessments like the high school graduation test. In addition, parents were now included within the placement decision process. So students weren't simply just placed in a room. Parents have more say-so in that. Were included in that conversation. Mediation system was now created. So litigation within the schools is becoming more prevalent at this time. And so schools were now required to bear the cost of a mediation system to mediate problems that were occurring between what the schools wanted versus what parents wanted. And then alternative placements were addressed. So students who required or needed an alternative placement, and last week I mentioned the GNETS program, so that's an example of an alternative placement where the current school isn't meeting the needs of the student within the least restrictive environment, so looking at an alternative placement, and that now has to be addressed within the IEP. So lastly, we have amendments made in 2004. In 2004, IDEA was now aligned with No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind was a big piece of legislation that came out in 2004 that mainly focused on teachers being highly qualified, as well as schools meeting annual yearly progress. Special education teachers are now required to be highly qualified within all the subject areas that they teach. And then another piece of important legislation within this amendment was that local education agencies were now required to provide services in private schools for students with disabilities. So if a parent chooses to send their kid with a disability to a private school, it's that local education agency's responsibility to provide those services or provide the funds for services that that student would have received if they were in a public school. So a very important term that came out of the original Education for All Handicapped Children Act is FAPE. So FAPE is the acronym we use. It stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. So the right to free appropriate public education is at the public school's expense, and this is something that every student has a right to. And basically what that means is that schools have to provide personalized instruction for that student, and it has to be sufficient support to allow that student to benefit educationally from the instruction. Now, an important thing to note is that schools are not required to maximize educational outcomes, okay? So it simply has to be sufficient, but it doesn't have to be maximized. And this actually came out of a court case in the early 1980s. It was the Board of Education versus Rowley. And this case dealt with a student who was deaf, and the parents wanted, basically, they wanted more services for the student. And the court ruled that the services the student was receiving were sufficient. The student was flourishing within the school, and the school was not required to provide that student above and beyond what they needed to benefit from their education. So this was a really important piece, and something that still it ends up in litigation a lot, is parents wanting more than what the schools are currently providing, but the schools are only required to provide what the student needs, not what they need to maximize. Okay, individualized education plans, another acronym you will hear a lot. So IEP, if students have IEPs, if they qualify for services under IDEA, every student will have one. And basically what an IEP is a written plan, and it's designed to meet the students' special needs and to ensure appropriate education is provided. So something I want to point out to you guys is that an IEP is a legal document, and it must be followed by everyone. So if you are a high school math teacher and you have a student in your room who has an IEP, and within that IEP there are certain accommodations for math class, you are legally required to provide those accommodations for that student. There's been litigation throughout history in which general education teachers were sued for not providing accommodations according to the IEP. So just know that if it's in the IEP, you are legally required to deliver that. Most of the time, if you have a student with an IEP within your classroom, that special education teacher will provide you with a copy of that IEP and the accommodations that that student needs. So make sure that you have those, that you're aware of them, and that you're implementing them. And if you maybe don't know how to implement them, seek out some help from the special education teacher to figure that out, because it's very important that you do. Now, in regards to other content within the IEP, the IEP will contain information about the student's current performance. So how are they doing? Annual goals are required, so they have certain goals they must meet. If a student has a disability in the area of reading, the annual goals will pertain to reading. If a student has a disability in multiple areas, the annual goals will pertain to multiple areas. In addition, students will have statements on how they're going to be assessed in those goals. There are short-term objectives, so your annual goal is something that's more extensive. It's looking at the whole year, where your short-term objectives are looking at smaller increments of time. So what are the small steps that student needs to meet in order to obtain that annual goal? So the IEPs are really extensive documents that contain a lot of information, so I encourage you to make sure that you are aware of students' IEPs when they are in your classroom. So lastly, we're going to talk about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So basically what the 504 says is that no otherwise qualified handicapped individual shall solely by the reason of his handicap be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination in any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So students or adults can't be excluded from something just because they have a handicap. Now within schools, you'll see that some students fall under IDEA and 504. However, there are some students who don't qualify under IDEA because they don't need special education and related services. So these students are going to have what's called a 504 plan. Some examples of students who have a 504 plan would be a student who has severe asthma, students who have ADHD, students with type 1 diabetes, sickle cell. So anything like that, typically these students will have a 504 plan. Again, this is a legal document that you're required to follow. And within the 504, there are certain accommodations. So examples of this might be that in order for a student to be assessed on a state assessment, they need to have proper health conditions. So a student with sickle cell would need to be in good health in order to have to sit for their high school graduation test. There might be procedures in there for how to complete medical procedures for students who need those. So a kid with asthma, within the 504, there will be specific instructions on how to handle their asthma. There may be guidelines on when these students can be excused from class due to their medical condition. So, All right, that's all for this week. I hope you guys have a fantastic week, and let me know if you have any questions.